Crispatics, African, and they took blood-borne, known-alone paths up and down Boston Harbor, escaped slave, harpooner, and rope maker. He never dreamt a pursuit of happiness or destiny, yet rallied beside patriots who hurtled a fury of snowballs, craggy, dirt-frozen chunks of ice and oyster shells at the stout flank of redcoats as the 29th Regiment of Foot aimed muskets, waiting for fire. How often had he walked gazing down at gray timbers of the wharf as if to find a lost copper coin. Wind devout, cold air as he stood leaning on his hardwood stick, and then 2 lead bullets tore his chest, blood reddening snow on King Street, March 5th, 1770. First to fall on captain's command. 5 colonists lay for cooling hours in Fernald's Hall before sharing a grave at the granary barren ground. He had laid a foundering stone for the Minutemen of Lexington and Concord, first to defy and die. And an echo of the future rose over the courtroom as John Adams defended the Brits, calling the dead a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes, and mulattoes, Irish Teagues, and outlandish Jactars, who made soldiers fear for their lives. And a day's end, only 2 would pay with the branding of their thumbs.
Among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism. Thomas Jefferson. Pretend I wrote this at your grave. Pretend the grave is marked. Pretend we know where it is. Copp's Hill, say. I have been there, and you might be, for mother, your name is the boat that brought you. Pretend I see it in the stone with a gruesome cherub. Children come with thin paper and charcoal to touch you. Pretend it drizzles, and a man in an ugly plastic poncho circles the Mathers, all but sniffing the air warily. We don't need to pretend for this part. There is a plaque in the ground for Increase and Cotton and Samuel, dead at 78, final son, who was there on the day when they came looking for proof. 18 of them watched you, and they signed to say, the poems specified in the following page were, as we verily believe, written by Phyllis, a young Negro girl who was but a few years since brought an uncultivated barbarian from Africa. And the abolitionists cheered at the blow to Kant, the Negroes of Africa have by nature no feeling that rises above the trifling. And the enlightened ones bellowed at the strike against Hume, no ingenious manufacturers amongst them, no arts, no sciences. Pretend I was there with you, Phyllis, when you asked in a letter to no one, how many I ams to be a real human girl? Which turn of phrase evidences a righteous heart? If I know of Ovid, may I keep my children? Pretend that on your grave there is a date, and it is so long before my heroes came along to call you a coon for the praises you sang of your captors who took you on discount because they assumed you would die, that it never ever hurt your feelings. Or pretend you did not love America. Phyllis, I would like to think that after you were released unto the world, when they jailed your husband for his debts, and you lay in the maids' quarters at night, free and a poor woman with your last living boy, that you thought of the metamorphoses, making the sign of Arachne in the tangle of your fingers. And here, after all, lay the proof. The man in the plastic runs a thumb over stone. The gray is slick and tough. Phyllis Wheatley, 31, had misery enough.
Torn from their native land, their friends and their homes, they were sold into the markets of Carolina and Georgia, feeling the hand of oppression bearing heavily upon them. They fled to Florida. Joshua R. Giddings, The Exiles of Florida. They weren't headed north to freedom. No, they weren't headed north to freedom. They fled away from the North Star, turned their backs on the Mason-Dixon line, put their feet to freedom by fleeing further south to Florida. Ran to where gator and viper roamed free in the mosquito swarm of Suwannee. They slipped out deep after sunset, shadow to shadow, shoulder to shoulder, stealthing southward, stealing themselves, stealing their souls to run steel through any slave catcher who dare try stealing them back north. They billeted in swamp mud, sawgrass, and cypress. They waded through waves of water lily and duckweed. They thinned themselves in thickets and thorn bush, hiding their young from thieves of black skin marauding under moonlight and cloud cover. Many once knew another shore an ocean away, whose language, songs, stories were outlawed on plantation ground. In southern swampland, they raised flags of their native tongues above whisper smoke into billowing bonfires of chant, drum, and chatter. They remembered themselves with their own words bleeding into English, bonding into Spanish, singing in Creek and Creole. With their sweat forging farms in unforgiving heat, never forgetting scars of the lash, fighting battle after battle for generations. Creeks called them Seminole when they bonded with the renegade Creeks. Spaniards called them Cimarrones, runaways, escapees from Carolina plantation death prisons. English simply called them Maroons, flattening the Spanish to make them seem alone, abandoned, adrift. But they were bonded, side by side, black and red, in a blood red hue. Maroon, sovereignty soldiers, black refugees, self-abolitionists, fighting through America's history, marooned in a land they made their own. Acre after acre, plot after plot, war after war, life after life. They fought only for America to let them be marooned, left alone in their own unchained, singing, worthy blood.
That was, in order, Yusef Kumunyaka reading his original poem about Crispus Attucks, Eve L. Ewing reading her original poem about Phyllis Wheatley, and Tyehimba Jess reading his original poem about the Black Seminoles. We will hear, let's have a round of applause. We're going to hear more from those three poets a bit later. Welcome. Welcome to all of you for a very special evening, for what we hope is going to be a very special project. We're grateful to all of you for being here. There was tremendous interest in this event, so when I say all of you, I don't only mean all of you who are here in this hall. We just had about 800 people tune in to the live stream of this event, and that includes around 115 who are at the Racial Justice Project in Asbury Park, New Jersey. Hello, Asbury Park. As well as a few other watch parties around the country. So to all of you who are watching from afar, we also say thank you for being with us tonight. I'm Jake Silverstein. I'm the editor of the New York Times Magazine, and tonight we're here to offer you a little glimpse of something, the first glimpse of something that we're calling the 1619 Project. It's an ambitious effort by the whole New York Times to mark the 400th anniversary of the moment in late August of 1619 when a ship arrived in Point Comfort, a coastal port in the British colony of Virginia, carrying between 20 and 30 enslaved people from the African nations of Ndongo and Congo. The arrival of these men, women, and children marked the beginning of American slavery, and it is the goal of this project to take the measure of the legacy of slavery in contemporary American life. This project kicks off this weekend with a special issue of the magazine. The whole magazine, front to back, is devoted to essays that examine contemporary phenomena that have their roots in slavery, in some cases perhaps surprising to readers. It also has a historical timeline that includes a bunch of poems and short pieces of fiction that imagine important historical moments of the last 400 years, and you just heard 3 of those poems. It also includes, on the same day, a special broadsheet section of the newspaper about the history of slavery that's been done in partnership with the Smithsonian, and we'll hear from the curator from the Smithsonian who took part in that in just a moment. But that's not all. Oh, and I should say, all of you who are here in the Times Center, you'll get to take an early copy of both the magazine and the special section when you leave tonight. That's a perk of being here tonight. You get to have a jump on the crossword puzzle. The project does not end there. It just begins there. Next week, the award-winning team behind our news podcast, The Daily, is going to be launching a multi-episode audio series called 1619. We'll have an educational outreach curriculum launching in partnership with the Pulitzer Center at the same time, and we'll have more information about that later. And then over the next weeks and months, you'll be able to see more stories on this subject in the magazine and in other sections of the newspaper, from sports to travel to cooking to styles and others. So keep an eye out for all of that. The goal of all this is to change the way that people think about American history and the American present by centering the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very heart of our national narrative. And tonight we're going to delve into the idea of what that means by bringing out some of the contributors, including those 3 poets, to both the special section and the special issue of the magazine to hear what they wrote about. We're also going to have time for questions. I hope you have questions. If you think of some during the evening, save them up. We'll have time at the end of it. It's a long program, but it's a good program. Before we begin, I want to say a few thank yous on behalf of myself and also everyone who's going to be up here on the stage tonight. We want to recognize the many people who made this event possible, the staff who cleaned and prepared this theater for all of us, the folks who are working the booth up there and the live stream. The people who worked the door, which was not easy, there was a line all the way down 41st Street and around the block. We also want to thank the Time staff who produced this event, the incredible writers, historians, journalists, photographers, artists, and illustrators who contributed to the project. And of course, thank you and a heartfelt bravo to the amazing team at the New York Times Magazine and NYT Mag Labs who just poured themselves into this project. It was very difficult work, and it's been a huge effort over the past 6+ months. And now, it is my great honor to introduce the very special person who's been the driving force behind all that effort, the person whose mind and spirit was the spark from which this project issued forth. She is a staff writer at the magazine. She is a MacArthur Fellow. She is the founder of the Ida B. Wells Society. She's the recipient of many awards, National Magazine Award, a Polk, a Hillman, a Peabody. She's the recipient of an honorary degree from Xavier University and a Lifetime Achievement John Chancellor Award from Columbia University. She is one of the most profound and tenacious journalists that I get to work with, and one of the most remarkable people that I'm lucky enough to know. Please help me welcome the one and only Nikole Hannah-Jones.
I cried like 5 times last week, and I'm just trying to get through this without crying. So thank you. Thank you for that. What if I told you that the year 1619 is as important to the American story as the year 1776? What if I told you that America is a country born of both an idea and a lie? I've been obsessed with the year 1619 since I first saw that date on page 29 of a landmark book called Before the Mayflower. I was a high school student, and I was taking my first Black Studies class, and I read these words by historian Lerone Bennett, where he describes the White Lion, which is the ship, of course, that brings that first group of enslaved Africans to Virginia. And he says of that ship, what seems unusual today is that no one sensed how extraordinary she really was. For few ships, before or since, have unloaded a more momentous cargo. Now my script is out of order. Like most Americans, I was taught very little about the institution of slavery. It, of course, explained the American presence of my family and all the Black people I knew and saw. But like most Americans, slavery was largely taught to me as something that was marginal to the American story. Slavery had to be mentioned in our history books because we had to talk about the Civil War. But outside of that, it was just a brief discussion that relegated slavery largely to the backward South and assured us as a nation that slavery had little to do with how our country developed. I studied Black Studies in college, and I've been thinking about the anniversary of 1619 pretty obsessively for the last few years. I knew that this was going to be an anniversary that was going to pass in most households without any notice, that most Americans would actually have no idea that there was even an anniversary that we should be acknowledging at all. But they should know this. And I believed that powerfully, because this anniversary is the reason we even exist as a country. We would not be a country. We would not be the United States were it not for slavery. When we think about the sheer wealth that the forced labor of those who were forced to come here from the continent of Africa produced for the colonies, it was this labor that made the struggling colonies wealthy. It was this labor that allowed these founding fathers to have both the wealth and the moxie to believe that they could break off from the most powerful empire in the history of the world, one of them, but certainly the most powerful empire at the time, and start their own country. We know that the enslaved grew and picked more cotton than anywhere else in the world at the time, supplying 66% of the world's supply. It was the money and the dizzying profits from the enslaved labor that paid off our war debts after the Revolutionary War, that financed some of our most prestigious universities, that helped fuel the Industrial Revolution. It was enslaved people who built and laid the railroad tracks that crisscrossed the South. At one time, the second richest man in the country was a Rhode Island slave trader who never had to own a single human being, but made millions of dollars transporting them across the Middle Passage. Here in New York, Wall Street was named Wall Street because that was the wall upon which enslaved people were bought and sold. And the very reason we are the financial capital of the world is because it is there that systems of banking and insurance and learning to collateralize rise up around the insuring and the collateralizing and the mortgaging of Black human beings. But much more important than the material wealth that enslaved people created for this country, what we're here to argue tonight is that we did something much less understood, but much more important. And that is that Black people have played one of the most vital roles as the perfecters of this democracy. Because you see, when the country's founding documents were written by enslavers, they were false. When a man by the name of Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." These are some of the most famous words in the English language. But as he wrote these words, he owned 130 human beings who would enjoy none of those rights. At that time, 1/5 of this country lived in absolute bondage. We were founded not as a democracy, but as a slaveocracy, a country run and ruled by slave owners. If this feels uncomfortable, simply imagine the truth that 10 of our first presidents trafficked in human beings and worked them on forced labor camps. But while the founders set up a decidedly undemocratic constitution that denied the franchise to the majority of its citizens, to women, to Native people, and to Black people, and also deprived absolute rights of 1/5 of the population, Black people actually believed and took those words literally. Black people responded to their enslavement by demanding and fighting not just for their own rights, but for universal rights. They believed those words that our founders did not. And from the moment when Crispus Attucks, a man who himself was not free, who was a fugitive from slavery, died for the freedom of this new nation, all the way to now when we see the Black Lives Matter protests, then we must acknowledge that it is Black people who have fought more than any other group to make the ideals laid out in the Constitution a reality. At the end of slavery, it is Black people who had been deprived by law of the right to read and to write who bring public education to the South. It is Black people who push for the amendments that end slavery. We are the third to the last country in the Americas to end slavery. We were not exceptional at all when it came to that. It is Black people who pushed for the amendments that provided equal protection under the law and granted citizenship to everyone who was born on this land, and universal suffrage, at least for men at that time, and that helped propel the first civil rights legislation that this nation ever passed. Yet 100 years later, Black people would still be fighting for the rights that they had guaranteed a century earlier. And the civil rights movement, which lasted decades and cost hundreds and hundreds of Black lives, set the stage for all other civil rights battles that this country would face. Immigrant rights, gay rights, women's rights, disability rights. All of these rights find their inheritance in the Black rights struggle. The civil rights victories that Black people won never ensured rights just for themselves, but for all marginalized people across this nation. We are a unique people on this soil. We came here under singular circumstances. No other group was forced to come here in chains in the bowels of a ship. No other group was completely severed from their homeland, from their families, from their languages, from their culture, from their religion. But as sociologist Glenn Bracey wrote, out of the ashes of white denigration, we gave birth to ourselves. Those who were enslaved, who were treated not as human beings but as property, created ourselves a new culture here, isolated both from our native lands and forcibly segregated from both mainstream white culture and from our home. We created what became really the only truly unique American culture that exists. You could say that those who were considered the least American have actually turned out to be the most. When the world hears quintessential American music, it is our voice that they hear. When they see the unique style and the avant-garde flair of Black Americans, this came from enslaved people's determination to exert our individuality in a system of chattel slavery that tried to take every sense of our humanity. When people snicker at Black naming practices, those naming practices of our most marginalized who refuse to take the European names of the people who owned us, but also to take the names of an African continent from which we've never visited, but to create our own, this is an act of resistance. It is not something for us to deride. The things that we have most maligned about Black people have actually been signs of our resilience and our determination to thrive under the most brutal circumstances. That Black people are very inconvenient to this country's narrative. In order to justify slavery and our original sin and the fact that we were not an exceptional nation, but one of many slave nations, we had to say that Black people were the problem. And we have spent 400 years studying the way that Black people are the problem. I would like to offer tonight in this 400th year, we need to stop thinking of Black people as the problem and start seeing us as a solution. My grandmother, Arlena Tillman, was born on a sharecropping farm in Greenwood, Mississippi. She spent most of her adult life under racial apartheid. She moved north thinking things were going to be better, but she didn't find a promised land there either. She never got to live her dreams. Like so many of our ancestors, she bore what she did so that we might be here today. And though she did not live to see this moment, though so many of our ancestors did not live to see this moment, we, the 40 million descendants of those who were enslaved in this country, we are the testimony. This project is above all else an attempt to set the record straight. To finally, in this 400th year, to tell the truth about who we are as a people and who we are as a nation and who we can be if we ever are willing to give up that lie. It is time to stop hiding our sins, but to confront them. And then in confronting them, it is time to make them right. I thank you all for coming and joining us tonight. And I hope that this is the place where we start. Thank you. Thank you. One of the reasons that I believe this project was necessary is because we don't teach the history of slavery in our schools. We cannot confront this, and so it's hard to understand where we are today when we don't understand the past. And what we get about slavery is not the unvarnished truth. So part of our effort is we created this special broadsheet section of the paper, And we produce it in collaboration with the Smithsonian. And in doing so, we're trying to set the record straight. If you haven't been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., you absolutely should. I've been 4 or 5 times, it's still not enough. It reframes the way that we see this history, much as we're trying to do today. And so our first guest is the woman who co-curated the Slavery and Freedom exhibit at the museum. She collaborated with us on the newspaper section. She picked the objects that are in there. She helped us write this story. The first time I met her, I told her she was going to be my best friend because she's just that amazing. Please welcome the Smithsonian's Curator of American Slavery, Mary Elliott.
Good evening.
Hey, Mary.
Hey, Nikole.
It's been a long journey together, right?
Yes, but a good one.
So, Mary is going in, the way that we decided to do the special section, we were inspired actually by the exhibit that Mary helped curate at the museum. So the special section is told through objects of the time of slavery. And Mary is going to take us through 3 objects that appear in the special section and talk to us about what they mean and why they're important. So, Mary, the first object that you're going to start with is an image of a sugarcane cutter. So talk to us about that.
So, as Nikole mentioned, we use objects to tell the story. And oftentimes people expect to walk into an exhibition and see an object and see this kind of description. This is a cane cutter, this size, made of wood, made of metal. But this, like this moment of 1619, this anniversary, opens up an opportunity to talk more in depth about slavery and freedom in this country and about slavery and freedom in the world. But the cane cutter allows us to talk about sugar. Most often when we think about slavery in the United States, we think cotton, but the transatlantic slave trade, the driver of the trade was sugar. It was the commodity that everyone fiended for, right? We had to anticipate what people would ask when they came into the exhibition, and one of the things we knew people would say in their effort to mitigate slavery in the United States was, well, we only had 400,000 people come to the United States. And there were millions more who went to South America and the Caribbean. Why? Because this was a deadly commodity. Lifespan to cultivate sugar was 7 years life expectancy, and it altered women's reproductive systems. And so for people to wrap their head around the fact that in the United States it was cotton, wheat, sugar, rice, tobacco, and that we perfected natural increase. 400,000 people came to what became the United States, but at the end of the Civil War there were 4 million enslaved African Americans who gained their freedom.
So the next image is the ballast stone.
The ballast stone. So we have a program called the Slave Wrecks Project. We go around and we look at slave shipwrecks around the world. We try to identify them, authenticate them, and raise artifacts from the ocean floor. The ballast stone is from the São José, a slave ship that left Lisbon, went to Mozambique, picked up captive Africans, was on its way to Brazil to sell them into slavery in Brazil. It crashed off the coast of South Africa. There were 512 enslaved Africans on board, 212 perished, the others were saved. Why? Because they were property and therefore profit. They were sold into slavery. But the ballast stone, what's important about that is it was the marker that helped us identify the ship, because ballast stones offset the human weight so the ships wouldn't turn over. Through doing archival research and maritime archaeology, we were able to identify this ship because the records show that there were 1,400 ballast stones aboard this ship. And when you think about it, think about how we read our landscape. Ballast stones cover the streets in Charleston, South Carolina. They come in different forms. In St. Croix, the ballast stones cover all of that landscape in the form of yellow bricks. So this is history in plain sight. You can't mitigate slavery. There's no such thing as a little bit of slavery.
And then the last image we're going to talk about is the Low Country basket. First, tell me why this was important for you to include, and then tell us why it matters.
The Low Country basket, like the other artifacts, open up a conversation about many different things. One thing that is extremely important is people say, well, they came with nothing. Really? We came with empty hands, but we did not come with empty heads. We have memories of our grandmothers, our foodways, the way we dressed ourselves, our governmental organizations, our military power, our intellect. And so people came with empty hands, but their intellect helped create an economic system that made this nation a powerhouse. When we went to visit the rice fields in Charleston, and we went to a place called Caw, the gentleman there who oversees that historic site said that a group of German engineers, hydraulic engineers, said there's no way anyone could recreate the landscape that these intellectual people of African descent created, that profitable landscape. And also the fact that this coil basket reminds you of the coil designs of the fanner baskets. Here you have this object that was used practically to separate the rice, but then also women putting their children in the baskets as they were doing the work that they were forced to perform. And so it really does open up a story about the history of this fight for power, economic, political, that came with a human cost.
I think that this is a particularly important thing to pause on, because what a lot of people don't know is enslaved people were brought from certain regions of Africa because of the particular knowledge that they had. We're often taught that they were simply there to be for brute labor, had no skills. We know that they taught Southern planters how to grow rice, that they came with iron working skills. Can you talk more about that? Clearly the perception that African people came with no intellect only is a further justification for slavery, but we know that that's not true.
No, there are Europeans who traveled throughout the Western African coastline, and when people say, you know, well, it's hard to get the records of observations of all of this activity going on, there were Europeans who documented the way that people of African descent were cultivating rice. And they were digging those trenches and using the trunk system, flooding the fields. And so they actually selected people from, you can literally look at the announcements, the advertisements in the 18th century newspapers that say Windward and Rice Coast Africans for sale in Charleston or Charlestown. So when people, you know, when folks say, well, that didn't happen, go to the record. It's documented in a very unapologetic voice. As one man said in the 18th century, William Cowpers, I admit I am sickened at the purchase of slaves, but I must be mum, for how would we do without sugar or rum? There was no reason to cover anything up, because as far as that society was concerned, it was fine. But with that mere quote, it makes you question your moral obligation to others.
Well, thank you so much for highlighting these objects for us. Please spend a lot of time with the special section that that Mary Elliott helped curate. I just think you will get a real schooling on this history. And I thank you for coming tonight and for your contribution to the project.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again to Mary. It was such an honor for us at the magazine and at NYT Mag Labs to get to work with Mary and the team at the Smithsonian to really ground this project in their knowledge and in their wisdom and in their historical rigor. Obviously, history is the kind of foundation of this project, but a lot of the history that we are interested in bringing forth with this project was not fully recorded. And so, in addition to turning to historians like Mary, people who can give us the facts, we also wanted to use imagination to find our way into the past. And so as part of this project, we asked a number of creative writers to imagine their way into key moments on a historical timeline of the past 400 years. So we had poets, we had novelists, we had some screenwriters, some playwrights. The timeline ran from August 1619 to August 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and exposed vividly that city's racial inequalities. We had Barry Jenkins writing about Gabriel Prosser's rebellion. We had Jesmond Ward writing about how the Congress's ban on the importation of enslaved people in 1808 only led to the intensification of the buying and selling of enslaved people and the further breaking up of black families. We had Z.Z. Packer writing about the massacre in New Orleans in 1866. Rita Dove and Lynn Nottage, or Rita Dove and Camille Dungy, rather, both writing about the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And Joshua Bennett writing about the founding of the Black Panther Party. And if any of those moments are unfamiliar to you, I invite you to turn to this historical timeline to learn more about these moments, these important moments in American history. Earlier tonight, to begin the evening, you heard 3 of the poems that are part of this historical timeline. You heard Yusef Kumunyaka writing about Crispus Attucks, a fugitive from slavery who was the first person to die in the American Revolution. You heard Eve L. Ewing writing about Phyllis Wheatley, the first African-American person to publish a book of poetry in this country. And you heard Tyehimba Jess reading his poem about the Black Seminoles. So we're going to get to talk to them about their 3 poems right now. Here we are. And the first thing that I want to do is to give you 3 a proper introduction, because due to the drama of our opening, we didn't get to do a proper introduction before. So we'll start with you, Tyehimba. Tyehimba Jess is a professor of English at the College of Staten Island and the author of 2 books of poetry. His first collection, Leadbelly, was published in 2005. His second, Olio, a combination of sonnets and narrative which demonstrate the ways that African-American performers have resisted and defeated the forces of minstrelsy, won the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. To his left, we have Dr. Eve L. Ewing. She's a writer, sociologist, and assistant professor at the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago, and she's the author of Ghosts in the Schoolyard, a rigorous study of the Chicago public schools.
Shout out to that person. Thank you.
I see we have some people from Chicago. Electric Ashes, a collection of
Arches.
collection of poetry.
Is the name of the book, not Ashes.
I'm sorry, Arches. A collection of poetry, essays, and visual art. And earlier this summer, she published 1919, a collection of poems shaped by that year's race riots. Eve also writes the Ironheart comic book series for Marvel, the collected first volume of which was released earlier this summer. And then to Eve's left, we have Yusef Kumunyaka, an award-winning poet, a professor of English at NYU, and the author of numerous collections of poetry, including Copacetic, Dien Kaudu, and Neon Vernacular, which won the 1993 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. From 1999 to 2005, he was the Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, and in 2016, he was named New York State's Poet Laureate. Please help me welcome these 3 wonderful poets. So it was an honor to get to have your work in this issue of the magazine, and I want to just start by asking you, the way we did this is that we had a list of events. I can't remember how many, but it was a lot. And in the end, we published, we were able, due to space and deadlines and all that, to publish 17 moments on this historical timeline, but we started out with many more. And we sent out this list to you and the other folks who contributed to this project, and people picked the event that resonated with them, and that they wanted to write about. So each of you picked your moments, and I'd like to start by just asking you, and perhaps we can go in chronological order, Yusef, starting with you, what it was that drew you to the moment. In your case, Crispus Attucks, the first person to be killed in the American Revolution.
Well, what was interesting to me about this individual is that he seemed so ordinary, but yet he was an escaped slave. So he had a certain kind of spirit and tenacity that he could push against things. He also knew how to work with his hands. So I come from that group of people who know how to work with their hands, physical labor. But there is also the feeling that it was impulsive. It was an impulsive action. It wasn't a planned action. It was just part of his DNA, we can say today. So, for me, it was the fact that the spirit of the individual was universal. Mm-hmm. He knew what freedom was. I think about what Toni Morrison said. She said, the function of freedom is to free others. But this was already playing out a long time ago, probably at least before 1619, because of the people who were brought here. Many of them have been captured as prisoners of war. So the fight was in them.
Mm-hmm. Eve, maybe we could then move to you. And why was it that Phyllis Wheatley was the person on that list that you thought, I want to write about that?
Sure. Well, it was a really difficult choice because, as you said, it was a long list and it's such an ambitious project, 400 years of Black history, all of which is worth talking about. But I think I felt a sense of obligation to uplift the voice and the story of Phyllis Wheatley. As a Black woman poet myself, and as someone who thinks a lot about the ways in which Black women are marginalized, even within stories about Black history and our narratives about Black history, as well as thinking about Black literary history, I felt an obligation to her, as I use the word foremother in the poem, and she lived a very difficult and short life. And there's a way in which when you are a person who's lauded or who gets to be the first of something, it's presumed that all that kind of laudatory experience just meant that you had an easy life. And so I, like probably many of us, saw her on lots of, exemplary Negro history book lists, posters on classroom walls and things like that as a kid, but didn't actually know a lot about her. And in diving into her life, felt deeply, deeply saddened by really what happened to her and her experiences, and felt obligated to tell that story, and really grateful that I had the chance to do it.
What were some of the things that you learned when you dove into her story?
Sure. So as I begin the poem with this quotation from Thomas Jefferson, and it was common belief among many of the people we consider the intellectual architects of Western thought that Black people were not capable of making art. So you hear the quote from Hume, from Kant, from Jefferson, those voices throughout the poem. And so when Phyllis Wheatley was purchased as a 7-year-old, and she came straight from Senegal, she was born on the African continent. And when she was purchased, she right away started to display these unusual habits. She started writing poetry at a really young age as someone who had only recently learned English. And nobody believed that a Black woman could write poetry, that a Black person could write poetry. I mean, this was believed on the level of scientific possibility. And so many of who we now consider the forefathers of this country actually had to show up and sign an affidavit. They quizzed her, they interviewed her, they asked her questions about herself and about her poems, and then they created this statement saying, yes, we can attest that she really wrote these poems. And so that's the proof. That is it was only real when a group of white men said, we witnessed it for ourselves. She really did write them herself. I've had experiences like that in my own life. And then the terrible irony of it is that during the Black arts movement, a lot of the poets that I grew up admiring the most actually very much disparaged Phyllis Wheatley because of some of the poems that she wrote that were seen to be not adequately political or not adequately critical of slavery. And so once again, she had to kind of prove, people said that she wasn't Black enough, about a woman who was literally enslaved. People 100 years said she wasn't Black enough. And so throughout her life and her legacy, even in death, having to kind of prove herself was this ultimate tragedy to me.
I want to come back to some of those points in a minute, but Tyehimba, can we talk about your selection and what it was about the Black Seminole story that appealed to you when you were looking at that list?
Well, I think the thing about the Black Seminoles is you're talking about really the idea that really the first Underground Railroad ran south. You're talking about folks in South Carolina bristling under slavery and deciding not to go north to the North Star, but to go south to Florida, which was at that time in a Spanish territory, and living there at first under Spanish dominion as Spanish citizens, and then when the Spanish left, staying there and communing with the Creek, and really establishing really the largest and most successful slave revolt in the United States, which you're talking about communities of hundreds of Black folks and red folks living in Florida and fighting successive wars, three separate wars with generals and people like Abraham, Osceola, Juan Cavallo, also known as John Horse, fighting over generations, and then signing a treaty with the United States, moving to Oklahoma, and then later on moving south of the border to Mexico, where some of them, their descendants still are today, in a little town called Nacimiento de los Negros, which is, it's just a fascinating story which runs all the way through American history up until today. Which I was upset that I did not find out about when I was being taught Black history through, I mean, all the way through college, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what intrigued me about this.
I want to dig into the history in the poems a little bit in more detail. And Yusuf, I want to come back to you for this. There's an interesting moment. You said that what drew you to this poem was Crispus Attucks, this average person who had this kind of vivid sense of freedom. And he is the hero of the poem, of course, but there's an interesting kind of unheroic entrance by John Adams, our second president, who comes in, I think, in the third or fourth stanza to the end. And I want to make sure that people understand exactly what's happening there. So John Adams is defending the British soldiers after this little skirmish, and they've shot and killed some colonists, including Crispus Attucks. And can you talk about what happens there and why it felt like the right ending to the poem for you? And you mentioned that it, I think you say, an echo of the future rose over the courtroom as John Adams defended the Brits. Maybe what you meant by an echo of the future there.
Well, essentially, I think it's a moment where class comes in, especially the way that John Adams defined. He says Irish Teagues. It's all about class. A motley crew, motley rabble. It's the same kind of things that we may hear even today. It is where, when you talk about, which we don't really talk that much about, when we talk about racism, we also have to talk about class. And the fact that these systems wouldn't exist if a system doesn't dominate the psyche of a people. And it's easy to dismiss the homeless or the individual who seems like he's not really pulling his weight for a system. So I saw all of that within John Adams' short statement. And it echoes right up to today.
And Eve, I want to come to this line that's in the middle of your poem that just stops me cold every time I read it, and I suspect there are some people in the audience tonight who were hearing the poem for the first time and maybe had the same experience. It's when you are imagining Phyllis Wheatley writing, "If I know of Ovid, may I keep my children." It's just a devastating line. And it feels to me like, in a way, it's the sort of heart of the poem. Can you talk about that line and what it means to you and where its power comes from and how it relates to her story?
Sure. Thank you for that. I think that there's a presumption throughout American history that continues into the present, that if Black people perform enough humanity in a forceful enough way, appealing to logic, that we can somehow win acceptance or be proven human or earn the rights to move, live, and breathe like human beings. And the system of white supremacy built upon the edifice of chattel slavery and the genocide of indigenous peoples, with which Nikole started us talking about, is based on the fundamental presumption that Black people are not human beings. That is an ideology that was a necessary precondition for slavery, and it's an ideology that I believe to the core of my heart persists in the United States today in a variety of nefarious forms, from our educational system to our prison system to our housing system to transportation inequality to medical schools where people still think that Black people have a higher pain tolerance, to the Black women dying in childbirth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are predicated upon a very basic idea that we're not humans. And if you are dealing with people that don't believe that, that's not a logical thing, and therefore it can't be overcome by logic. And so the tragedy for me of someone who was clearly so exceptional and such a miraculous person, nevertheless dying a very, after she became a free woman, Phil Sweetley became a free woman, she was freed by the people who owned her. And then when they died, she didn't really have any protectors. And no one to kind of sell her books. She was married to a free Black man who wasn't able to find work. So she ended up being a scullery maid, which is kind of like the lowest ranked person as a household laborer. And all of her children died, and eventually she and her last child die. And so her exceptionalism, her magical wit, her poetry wasn't enough to save her from that kind of ignoble death. And that's because the people around her didn't think she was a human person. And there was nothing she could do to prove that.
Tyehimba, I want to give you a chance to come into this and ask you about the language. So there's an interesting part in your poem where you say, "Many once knew another shore, an ocean away, whose language, songs, stories were outlawed on plantation ground. In swampland they raised flags of their native tongues." And the language in the poem itself is just so great and so incantory, and it's summons so much power. But it seems like you're also writing about the exercise of language and the use of these people of language. And I wonder if you can talk about how, first of all, what the history is there as far as the way people were using, these people that you're writing about were using their own native tongues, but also what that meant to you as a poet.
Well, specifically, it's about prohibiting the enslaved to speak their native language for fear that they might foment some type of revolt against the plantation owners. So you can't speak the language that you were raised with on the continent. You have to speak English, and it raises a question about, well, what happened with those languages? How much of those languages were retained? And we can actually, when we look at Geechee and Gullah culture, right, we can see retentions of those Africanisms, today. But I'm also imagining the idea of not being able to speak your own tongue under pain of death or whipping or whatever, and then escaping and being in a place where you can anoint the land with your own language and the sound of your own music and the sound of your own drums, which were also prohibited, and being able to celebrate your humanity through the language that you were born into, and imagining that kind of freedom. And I think, I still have to reflect on the idea right now that this craft that we're exercising today, I still marvel at the fact that, this is not something my great-grandfather would have been able to do. And I imagine, what was the first poetry workshop? Learning the letters of the alphabet and learning the sound of how the sound of one's names looks in script, right? And renaming one's own self. right? And reclaiming oneself through manipulation of this language that we have been forced and born into. So all of that is what's going through my mind when I'm reading those lines.
We don't have time for too much more, but I do want to ask, since you brought up the imagination and kind of you were trying to imagine your way into what it would have been like, I wonder if you guys could talk about, so this is a historical project, the 1619 project. It's the purpose of this whole project is history, and it's also explicitly revisionist in its tendency. We're trying to, express some things that we feel like people don't understand about American history. And I want all of you in your own work have over many years felt drawn to history, have written whole books about historical periods. I wonder if you can talk to us about what it is that you think poetry has to offer to this kind of a project, and what it is that you think the imagination of these worlds of the past, how that can help us here in the present understand the past more deeply. I would love to hear from each of you on that.
We were just talking about this before we came in, and I think that, we've written in other genres, I'm, write in many genres, but I think that we live in a time where information is more accessible than ever before. But I think poetry can play a unique role in provoking people to go out and learn things. So I hope everybody tonight is going to go learn things they didn't know about Crispus Attucks and Black Seminoles and Phyllis Wheatley. And that information is always available. And I mean, there's been incredible scholarship on all of these topics. But what poetry can do is invite people in a different way and also provoke a moment of empathy and imagination. And I hope that all of our poems, I think that all of these poems are asking people to be in a moment. For me, beginning in the moment of understanding that we don't know where Phyllis Wheatley's even buried. So me having to imagine what it would be like to visit her grave, right, is something that is only possible through the speculative space of a poem. But I think that that's something poetry can do that's really special.
I have to admit that I've been writing on this for a very long time, to the extent that an excavation of history is in the project that I was writing called the Wishbone Trilogy. And what it involved, going all the way back, really to 1607, talking about indentured servants, which was we could say, before slavery was introduced to Virginia, which was, I think, 1641, when blacks were actually identified as slaves in Virginia. But before that, of course, blacks have been identified as property in all places. Of all places, we think of Boston. We usually don't think, we think about the South. We don't think about the North. But the North, that's where it really begins. And we can also think about the fact that here in New York City, which almost happened, if New York City had seceded and joined the South because of cotton. It's all about economics in the founder analysis.
Well, I would just say, we were talking about the statue to what Confederate general was that down in Charlottesville? Someone knows.
Robert
I
Lee.
was looking for
Lee,
Jamelle
right?
to see it.
And we were thinking about how it was blacked out with garbage bags, put with garbage,
Shrouded,
so it became a negative image. And the question about, we're at a time where we're reevaluating, we're constantly reevaluating America's history. And these poems that we bring into the world are part of that reevaluation. I don't have the skills to build a statue, but I do have the skills to put on paper the history in new ways to fascinate people and bring people into a story that is their own story, and that they can use to see a different understanding of their possible futures.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to just thank you three so much. It has been such an honor. Thank you. And I would just say to all of you, you know, it always helps to read a poem after you hear it a second, third, fourth time. So make sure you check out their 3 poems as well as all the other creative works in the issue in the magazine on your way out. Thank you again very much.
So I joked earlier that I was going to sit down and sing an original song, but I can't play the piano, nor can I sing. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to hear from some of the writers who wrote some of the essays in the magazine. When I first pitched this idea to Jake and my editor, Elena, I said that I thought that slavery, that nothing about modern American society has been left untouched by this legacy, that it is often rendered invisible, but that if you look at almost anything in American life, you can actually explain why things are in this country by going back to slavery and often the anti-Black racism that developed to support it. So when you read the magazine, you'll see that each of the pieces starts with a modern phenomenon, and then it explains it to you and traces the roots back through very rigorous reporting. So we have stories about democracy. We have stories about sugar, why Americans consume more sugar than any other Western country. We have stories about traffic jams and how those relate to our desire to segregate people. We have a story about violence in the criminal justice system, about geography, about capitalism itself. So I think when you go through the magazine, you will really see what I see every day, which is that the legacy is part of everything in our society, and it doesn't only impact Black Americans, it actually impacts all of us who are Americans, and many of us in other countries as well. So tonight, we're going to talk to 3 of the writers who worked on various pieces for this project. We're going to talk to Jamelle Bouie, who is a columnist for the New York Times. We're going to talk to Wesley Morris, who is a staff writer for the magazine, my very dear friend. Am I supposed to be walking over there?
I mean, you can just come right over.
You got it, Nikole. It's your show. You just do what you want.
We're going to be talking to Wesley Morris, who is a staff writer at the magazine, and we're going to be talking to Linda Villarosa, who's a contributing writer to the magazine, and I think I was supposed to move over here, so I'll awkwardly come over now. Hey guys.
Hello.
Hi, Nikole.
Hi. I have to say, some of you were easier to convince to work on this than others. I won't call anyone out.
By all means, do.
Well, he wouldn't even answer my text, so.
Hey, listen. I'm bad at answering text messages from everyone, so don't take it personally.
But what I was asking you guys to do was not easy, and I understood that, and also, you know, you guys are working on lots of other things as well. But I think all 3 of your essays are very powerful, and I'm excited to talk to you about them tonight. So I'm going to start with you, Jamelle. Your essay is about our modern political system, and I imagine many of us are trying to grapple with where we are in America. And of course, lots of Black folks were like, you know, telling white people, welcome to the America we've been living in for a long time. But I really love your essay, and it really helps us explain how we got here. Right. And I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about it right now.
Sure. So I cover politics most of the time, and the thing you asked about and the thing I sort of honed in on was obstruction. American politics right now, and for the last 10 years, has been defined by sort of a hyper-obstructionism. And there are some obvious links to slavery. You can look to the Electoral College, you can look to the Senate, even institutions that in the antebellum period empowered slave owners and kind of created a culture, an obstructionist culture that could manifest itself at times. But I wanted to go a little deeper than that and think about sort of the ideological basis of the obstructionism we've been seeing for the last 10 years, because it's distinct. It isn't just we want to stop the other side from doing stuff. It involves arguments about the legitimacy of the other side. It involves claims about the legitimacy of national majorities, that most Americans might want this thing, but because that majority doesn't consist of the right kind of people, it's not a legitimate majority. And you see that kind of thinking, that kind of sort of obstructionist opposition to majorities, this belief that that small distinct minorities have not just a right to input and a right to shape the final outcome, but a right to veto outcomes that they do not think they don't agree with. That's a product of slavery. That's a product of sort of the political culture of slaveholders in the antebellum United States. And so the guy I spent a lot of time on is John C. Calhoun, who's a terrifying man. As you can see, he looks not well. He's poisoned by racism.
Being an enslaver will really, it'll do it.
Yeah,
it is bad for your skin in so many ways.
And hair.
Not a great skincare regime going on there. But Calhoun is interesting because he is sort of an intellectual. He's a planter intellectual, and he helps lead the South in developing kind of an anti-majoritarian ideology and position against the North, against sort of mounting anti-slavery sentiment. And what I find so interesting about Calhoun is that his theories of concurrent majority, meaning that for a proper majority, the way it works is that every single constituent part signs off on it, and if that doesn't happen, the constituent part can say, no deal, nothing's gonna happen. This kind of approach to politics, this very reactionary, anti-majoritarian approach, it basically, but it sort of drives the energy towards the Civil War, right? It is, secession happens in part because the South is convinced that unless it can control the federal government in its entirety, it cannot protect slavery. And after the war, this way of thinking doesn't actually die off, it kind of just persists. And even as it becomes attenuated from slavery, it still becomes a part of American reactionary politics, of racially reactionary politics. And I think you can make a pretty good case that in the present today, the efforts to restrict the electorate to just white people, the efforts to reshape and restructure American democracy to favor low-populated, small rural areas, the whole census question thing that happened the past couple months, that reflects Calhoun's influence on American politics. And so in this subtle but very important way, Calhoun and kind of the intellectual movement he inspired, I think is shaping the structures of American politics today, and it has influenced the obstruction and the sort of reactionary energy that I think we've experienced in American politics for the last decade.
Thank you. So Linda, in a magazine full of essays that were very hard to read, yours was amongst the most difficult. And I mean that because your article is about the torture of enslaved people, ostensibly to advance science. And I would love for you to share some of your essay with us today.
I want to start by saying I was not one of the people you had to try very hard to.
I was grateful. This is true. Please. She was ready.
So thank you. And
thank you
for both of your essays.
I mean, the way you do it, it makes it seem like people had to do the math now to figure out which of us.
I mean, I've already been roasted for it a little bit, so, you know.
It was everyone on the stage except you.
Yeah. So my essay looks at discrimination in our current healthcare system and traces it back to slavery. And the discrimination I saw firsthand when reporting on infant maternal mortality, firsthand reporting on HIV/AIDS in the South, and firsthand when my own father was treated really poorly by the medical system. So my story begins with John Brown. And John Brown was an enslaved man, there we go, on a plantation in Georgia in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And he was fortunate enough to escape and write a book. So reading his story was really compelling because he told it in his own words and in his own voice. So he was loaned to another enslaver who was a medical doctor. And so that doctor was trying to find a cure for sunstroke. So he took John Brown, put him in a pit of hot coals, it reached 100 degrees, and basically tortured him and had, only his head was out. So he fed him different remedies until he passed out. And then he did it again and again, and he created this bogus sunstroke remedy. So then, next, Dr. Hamilton was trying to prove his obsession with black skin being thicker than white skin. So he burned John Brown until he was scarred and he was in so much pain that he could no longer work in the fields, which he was still doing during this experimentation. So this was really hard to deal with. It was really hard to, read and absorb. And there were a lot of examples of this, but because you two hog so much space with your essays on politics and music,
keep it coming, Linda.
I limited to the medical myths I was looking at to two. And one was the idea that blacks have extremely high pain tolerance and a kind of superpower against pain. And the second one was that we have diminished lung capacity that was actually helped by working in the fields. So I know, so the idea about the diminished lung capacity really came from Thomas Jefferson. And so he wasn't a medical doctor, but he was widely respected. And so in 1787, he wrote this long piece called Notes on the State of Virginia about a lot of different things, but almost as a kind of throwaway, he mentioned this idea about diminished lung capacity in black enslaved people. And right away, medical doctors and scientists jumped on that in the South because they were looking for a way to legitimize both enslaving people, but also taking it a step further to say, no, this is really good. Being out in the sun and working hard will really build up the lungs. I know. And no one embraced it with more vigor than Samuel Cartwright, who was a physician in Louisiana. He was in New Orleans. And so his idea, so he had a very long study that he presented at a medical conference, and it was also reprinted in a scholarly journal that talked about all the ways blacks are different from whites, including the diminished lung capacity. And then he went this sort of bizarre step further and talked about a disease called drapetomania. So drapetomania was what happened to black people that made them escape slavery. And so the cure for it, not surprisingly, is working them harder and beating them harder. So I'm reading this and I'm thinking, what a nut job this guy is. And he's crazy, and this is crackpot stuff. But it was in legitimate medical journals. It was presented at medical conferences. It was picked up and legitimized. So even this guy Cartwright's theories still are present in today's medical practice. He used an instrument called a spirometer, which measures lung capacity. So he built in measurements in the machine about race. So it was a race correction that said black people have diminished lung capacity. So that machine is still used today, and it still has the race correction of 10 to 15%. So it looks at black lung inferiority. And I had bronchitis a few years ago, and I had to breathe into a spirometer to test my own lung function. And I thought, I wonder if my doctor put my race in to calibrate it, so it can measure that difference. And then finally, the last part of these old theories that are really myths that have stuck around is the idea of high pain tolerance in blacks. And so in 2016, that's only 3 years ago, there was a study of 200 medical students and residents. And it asked them to sort of talk about pain, perceived pain of their patients. And it was very specific. It was like, if your hand gets slammed in the door of a car, or if you break a bone, what is the perceived pain that you experience? And the medical residents and students and residents, mainly the white ones, perceived that Black people were less sensitive to pain and had a higher pain tolerance. And then really the worst part of this was they also believed the lie, the false assumption that Thomas Hamilton tortured John Brown to prove, and that is that Black skin is thicker than white skin.
So when you think about, I mean, it's, you know, I heard some people chuckling at some of this because it does seem bizarre, but the consequences are real. And the consequences of Black people not being prescribed pain medicine when they are in excruciating pain, not being given follow-up exams because there's a belief that we don't need them. It's deadly. You look at life expectancy, you look at, as you write about, maternal mortality, which regardless of income or whether Black women are insured, still shows up. There are very devastating and deadly consequences. And that science was used to justify the torture that was required to enslave people and force them to work. And so I think what your piece does very powerfully is show how we think we're smarter now, we think that's bizarre, and yet we still have those same notions. They don't simply go away because the institution of slavery has gone away. Thank you for that. And now, Wesley.
Yes?
So it was really important for me. One, Wesley is a brilliant writer, a very dear friend of mine, makes me think about music and culture in ways that I'm not very sophisticated about those things. And it was really important that everything in this magazine not be about how poorly we have been treated. And that some things in this magazine also needed to tell the story of our contributions and what we have created in the most horrific circumstances. And that's why I really wanted you to write about music, but also understanding that no one's really surprised that Black people have made musical contributions. So how could we tell this story in a way that digs a little bit deeper than that? And you really created just a profoundly beautiful and funny as usual in some ways essay that talks about, you know, when we talk about Black people, we always have to put that hyphen in. But the truth is, Black music is American music. And that's really what your essay is arguing.
Yes. It's complicated, though. I mean, part of the reason I gave Nikole the runaround was because she wanted me to, in 4,500 words, tell the story of American music for this issue.
I acted like an editor, sorry.
And I guess the question was how do you satisfy Nikole's entirely necessary tonal question while also acknowledging this very real reality that Black American music didn't start in America necessarily with Black people. Mm-hmm. Where it started was with a white guy who, the myth goes, happened upon an old Black man who was grooming a horse on land owned by a gentleman whose last name was Crow. And during this happening, this sort of magical occurrence in which this white man, his name was Thomas Dartmouth Rice, known eventually throughout the world as T.D. Rice, he sees this Black man, and the Black man is grooming the horse, humming a tune. His hands are palsied in some way. So goes the story. And he's grooming the horse in a way that is just strange, but also apparently captivating to Thomas Dartmouth Rice, who was an actor, by the way, an actor who I would argue was looking for something to distinguish himself from all the other actors who were in these troupes performing in shows. And he sees this man grooming this horse and a light bulb goes off. And he thinks, oh, okay, this is a great tune. These movements are so strange. And it couldn't have just been that the tune was interesting and the movements were strange. It had to have also been the combination of those two things in tandem with this man's position. And also this man's position as a black person. So he has this inspiration to, and this is a really human inspiration, right? Like if you watch, YouTube is full of a moment like this where you see something and your automatic response, if it's great, or even if it's awful, but mostly if it's great, is to duplicate it in some way. So he takes this moment, runs to a theater, I'm abridging, and rather than take the tune and the movements and just go on stage and do those, he kind of has to signal to the audience that he is not himself and that he's giving a performance. And the only way he can think to do that, now he's not the first person to do this, but the natural conclusion you draw if you want to get at the verisimilitude of the thing you've just seen on this property is to, I don't know, blacken your face. So he burns some cork into a liquid form, lets it cool, probably uses a cloth or something to put it on his face, but applies it. And there's another part of the story where he takes a different black man's clothes, puts those on because those are raggedier and more indicative of a kind of social station as a black person, and goes out on stage in these clothes and this black face and performs a song that he'd written the lyrics to the tune that he heard the horse groomer do while he groomed that horse. And by the way, he didn't catch the man's name. We don't know what the man's name is. So T.D. Rice, of course, gives him a name. I think I told you earlier that the property that the man was grooming the horse on was owned by a white man named Crow. So he writes a song, eventually the song that would sweep the nation, about an old black man jumping Jim Crow. And so here you have in this moment the birth of American racism's great mascot. You have something that most audiences in that moment would never have seen, no audience really would ever have seen before. They've seen men perform in blackface, but never with the sort of flair that T.D. Rice has. He was an actor. I don't know what kind of singer he was. The stories don't really get at the quality of his voice, but he had something. He had a star quality. And so the place goes nuts. It's the Beatles landing at, was it LaGuardia or JFK or whatever? It's a moment like that. And American culture is really never the same. But from that, I mean, it's a long story, it's a mess. I'm telling you the setup. We get Jim Crow in this moment, we get American popular culture in this moment. Before this moment, it's all European operas and British theater, and nobody liked it. They wanted something that was, well, I didn't. They wanted something truly American, and this was it. So from this moment, you have the basis upon which all of the sort of cultural tug of war begins about whose stuff is really what. And part of that is a matter of music. Now, I want to sort of fast forward. I'm gonna skip this guy.
Yeah, because you got 4 minutes.
I know, it's true. But this was interesting because I do think that Lil Nas X represents a kind of reverse frontiersmanship. This is a song that is ultimately, as far as I'm at least concerned, whether Billy Ray Cyrus is involved or not, I do think his participation is important, but I think the song without Billy Ray Cyrus is it's a song about a declaration of independence. Now, I know he wrote it about dropping out of school and everything, but whatever. It also, to me, in his embrace of a Western frontier culture, also makes him an expansionist in some way. And that's, I mean, it's powerful, it's under 2 minutes, it's the song of the year. But what I really what really to me is the thing that I was most excited to write about, and I did this for you, Nikole, because I was looking for, I wanted to try to find something that like spoke to the thing that I think you made me want to do, and that I also believed in terms of what this project was sort of morally responsible to do, was to find something that was obvious in terms of its cultural importance, but was also entirely Black in what it was, and the thing that sort of I think is the greatest advertisement for Black people, Black culture, all that we can do and are and can be, that also isn't announcing itself in such an obvious way. So for all the people on the live streams right now who are listening, you're gonna lose us for a second because we don't have the rights to this. Martha and the Vandellas doing Heat Wave. Just go to YouTube. It's the one with 7 million views. Here we go. I don't know. That's just beautiful. And part of what's beautiful about it to me is, this is a Motown song, it's Martha and the Vandellas. And this music is made in the same place that cars were made. And it was made with the same sort of ingenuity that Ford auto plants produced automobiles. And sorry. I don't know. It is the greatest, I would say, cultural product involving Black people almost from top to bottom, in which you have this marriage of Western cultural music and values with white Western cultural values and music, with Black cultural values. You have the Black church and you have the juke joint, and you have classical music happening all at the same time. You hear tubas and tambourines and strings and these Black women singing about having a crush on a guy. And, it's anti-minstrelsy in so many ways, but, and we talk about it in terms of we think about Motown now as very square, right? And this is the most respectable presentation and the sort of the most stodgy presentation of Blackness. But I don't know. If you think about 100 years of how stupid and inadequate and subhuman and unworthy of the vote and impervious to pain, this is the #1 thing you can do to combat that. And they sold a lot of money and made a lot of people rich and famous. And a lot of people real proud of themselves, so thanks. Sorry, Nikole.
No, you actually ended right on time.
Well, we can talk for a second because we didn't. I'm sorry, I went long, but
you didn't. You didn't go long. Okay. I am mindful. No, I do, but I'm also mindful of everyone's time. And we're getting ready to open up for Q&A.
Oh, good.
So I do want to just say, for all of us, this was writing was very emotionally taxing. Several of us have cried during the writing of this, and I just think we all realize that the wounds are still so fresh, even though we like to believe that there's a great deal of distance. So I just appreciate your vulnerability, both in the writing and on stage tonight. And I thank all of you for taking part in the issue. Could we give them all a round of applause? So according to my script, it says lights down on the panelists and Jacob at the podium. Am I doing something wrong?
I'm gonna go get my stool.
Are you just gonna walk off?
Follow the stool.
Did I do something wrong?
They're good.
No. You're good. We're just going off script now. Here, I brought you these.
Oh, I don't need this many. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm just gonna ask some questions then while we're doing this, or no? No, move on?
Well, just let's bring out everybody, because they're all going to come out now. Everybody's coming out now so that you can ask them questions. We are going to have some questions. When the questions are over, we're going to have a special surprise at the end of the evening. So make sure that you stick around through it. As we're bringing everybody out and getting seated, I also want to just take a moment for some thank yous. As you're probably beginning to gather, this is an enormous project, and it took a great deal of work from a great many people to pull it off. So we want to recognize some of them by name. First of all, I want to thank A.G. Sulzberger, our publisher, Dean Baquet, our executive editor, and Meredith Levian, our executive vice president and chief operating officer, for their unflagging support of this project and for the vision and leadership that have helped it expand into something really big. Hold your applause, please, to the end, because I have a bunch of people. Thank you also to the team at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, especially Mary Elliott. Where's Mary?
Oh, hold the applause.
We're not supposed to clap.
Mary Elliott,
Black people don't listen.
Fleur Pacer, and Julissa Marenko. Thank you to John Sawyer and Mark Schulte at the Pulitzer Center. We'll hear more about what they've done in just a second. And to the magazine staff, a big special thank you to Elena Silverman, Caitlin Roper, Gail Bickler, Kathy Ryan, Jessica Dimson, Ben Grangenet, Deb Bishop, Claire Gutierrez, Jasmine Hughes, Jeannie Choi, Jessica Lustig, Bill Wasick, Erica Summer, Molly Bennett, David Karthus, Claudia Rubin, Nicole Phillip, Maggie Kislick, Kiana Williamson, Alex Forstenzer, Blake Wilson, and Kate LaRue. That is only a partial list. If I were to name everybody who worked on this project, we would be here all night. So I want to thank so many of these people. They have all touched this project, given deeply of themselves, and we're very grateful to you. And now we're going to take some questions from all of you.
Now we're going to clap. Yeah.
Okay, so we have microphones down here. If you're here in the hall, you can come down to the microphones and just go ahead and ask your questions. We also have, I've been told we have 275 questions piling up from the people who are watching on the live stream. So if you're watching on the live stream, we're not going to answer all your questions. I apologize. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, first of all, this is extraordinary. But what I'd like to know from the New York Times, how are you going to use this profound amount of information that you have to inform your contemporary coverage?
Well, it's a great question. The project is going to be going on for the next couple of months, and as I said at the outset, we will be publishing more stories that are kind of under this umbrella of the 1619 Project throughout the paper, elsewhere in the magazine, and those are a start for what you're talking about. But I think also this whole project is a way of trying to open up a conversation about how all the stuff we've been talking about tonight, and obviously that's just a sample of what's in the magazine, still informs so much of contemporary American life. So, I think this project itself is a start.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just to sort of follow up on that though, the idea that this is happening in this newspaper right now is, okay. I do think that, there is a scenario in which somebody tells Nikole no, and that this is not something that they need to, or they're like, well, if this is how you feel, Ms. Hannah-Jones, why don't you just write a story? And leave it at that. I think that I mean, it just does not, I'm not addressing the nature of your question, but what I'm saying is there is room in this newspaper to achieve things like this too.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I just would say also, when I was just giving some thank yous, I mentioned the leadership at the newspaper. This project is pretty much the biggest thing we've ever done. You know, it's not just a special issue of the magazine, it's a special section of the newspaper, a multi-part podcast, a whole educational outreach program, which we'll talk about in a moment, other stories throughout the organization, this event, more events, and it is that size and that scope and that kind of focus and attention in part because folks like H.G. Sulzberg, our publisher, and Dean Beckhay, our executive editor, and our business leadership all immediately saw when Nikole first brought this idea up how important it was and how important it was to kind of put all the resources of the organization behind it. So, you know, I do think that Wesley has a good point there.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
I'm with the Smithsonian. I'm not on the staff, obviously, with the New York Times. But in doing this project, the staff, from the editors to designers and others, said that they had an education in putting together this piece. And so the word I would use is transformative. Yes. And you need to read between the lines because you might see that perhaps when they approach designing something that speaks to the Black experience in America, you might see something with a more sensitive touch, or you might find that the words that are used are words that have more of a notion of, I need to think about this a little bit differently about how I write about this. And so I think that's important because there is that learning curve and there's some things that people learned over this process. And so that's very important to share.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Frank King. Hey. I have really, it's a two-part question. Really, the first part is pertaining to what was your biggest challenge internally, not just with yourselves, but here, and coming up with these stories and writing them and committing yourselves to them. And my second part of that question is for the people that were not involved, but this relates to and reflects, how do you plan to, in your, I guess how do you plan to inform them as well? To keep them to say, this is, to relate like this is your struggle, this is your story too. You may be on the business side or you may be in tech, but this is much as your struggle and story as everyone else. And though you were not a part of it and putting this all together, like how can you, I guess, what would you do in speaking to them? What would you say to them to let them know that they could spread it to their teams internally?
I'll take the first part. So I was writing about something really traumatic and torture and suffering, and it was really hard. And I started to numb out a little bit so I could soldier on. And then this weird thing happened. I was finishing my essay about all these terrible things and kind of numb, and I was frying fish. All right, frying fish for dinner. And I splattered grease on my arm. So I got a big bandage on my arm that you can't see. And I got a 2nd-degree burn. And I was like, I have low pain tolerance, okay? It hurt so much. And I thought, oh my God, this was nothing compared to what John Brown had to endure. And I realized, stop numbing out. Like put this in this essay, put the pain and the anger in, write it in.
I'll answer the second question as a way of also addressing the previous question. I think that I applaud everyone at the Times and the tremendous team that it took to pull off something so monumental. And particularly, I think we should give another round of applause to Nikole. That's the loving part. The critique part is that it's really, I'm not going to say easy, but comparatively easy to look back at 400 years and to document all the things that felt backwards, that felt unscientific, that felt bizarre and crackpot, that felt inhumane. And the lesson from that analysis is not how terrible we've always been, But the lesson is how easy it is to uphold great cruelty as the status quo, and to uphold basic dehumanization as the bedrock of the society in which we move and live. Because all of the people we've talked about, all of the eras in which they lived were normal to them. All of the systems that we're condemning now were normal to them. And so the call becomes not looking backwards, but also in the tradition of Sankofa, looking forwards. And therefore, my loving ask of the Times and of any of the other institutions that you're talking about is thinking about how are we replicating these dehumanizing narratives every single day? How are we, in fact, at risk of undermining this kind of great work if it sits in parallel to rhetoric that continues to demonize and dehumanize Black people, Black trans people, Black undocumented people, Black disabled people, Black queer people, Black people with HIV, Black poor people, and so on and so forth. And that's the kind of questioning that we have to take into all of these institutions. It's not just learning in terms of like learning lots of facts, but learning modes of questioning that we need to be constantly interrogating in a time where we're facing the rise of authoritarianism, which rests upon regular people doing nothing and asking nothing.
Do we have any more questions? Anyone have a question? Yeah, please come down to the microphone so we can hear you.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, so my name is Sokhna Jada. I am a first generation African American from Senegal. So when I heard you say Senegal, I kind of clapped for myself. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this. So like, I've heard some folks tell me, I am mad at Africans and I am mad at my African ancestors for selling my people to these white folks and enslaving us and forcing us to be here. Stop calling me African American because I am not from Africa. I am from America. I am a Black American, not African American. And for me, that kind of causes a split because, I spent half of my life in Senegal and the other half here. So it's kind of like, should I call myself a Black American or an African American? What do you say to these people who want to cut their ties from Africa because they have been here for generations long enough to say, I am a Black American?
So, hey, she is my guest. I invited her here. She's a great student activist for integration in the city. She is an activist with a group called Teens Take Charge. And hey, Marcus. Very brilliant young lady. I appreciate your question. And I'm going to answer that because I think in some ways my essay gets to that. I've thought a lot about this myself through the years. And part of what my essay is talking about is this peace and respect that comes from not looking for identity elsewhere, not feeling as Black people that we can't claim our own country, not feeling as Black people that we can't claim the only country we've ever known. Yes, we are descended from Africa, but one cannot call us African people. We've never been there. We don't speak any of the languages. We can't tell you which culture we came from. So I think it's okay to acknowledge both of those things, to say that this is our people who we descended from, but we are American. And I think for you, I think that you call yourself what you want to call yourself. Yeah. I think that you choose the identity that you want to choose, because one thing that we know about Black folks is we are very accepting. Well, we take everybody. I know people who literally are not Black who we will call you Black. Not Rachel Dolezal, though. We're not claiming her. But it's complicated, right? The histories are complicated. Who gets to immigrate from Africa to America is complicated. What role people who come from the continent feel they play in the hierarchy in America plays a role as well. I think it's very complicated. But I think that what we do know is Amadou Diallo was shot, and it didn't matter that he wasn't Black American, right? We know that when people look at a person who is Black, they treat them like a person who is Black, and it doesn't matter what their heritage is. And in that way, we have a common community, and I think those are the things that we need to acknowledge. Thank you for your question.
And to add to that just a little bit, I think Because I've seen some of this conversation too, especially online, this idea that there needs to be some rigid division. And I think what's missed in that is that there's this long history of Black internationalism.
Of course.
Of African Americans, of Africans, sort of recognizing the differences, recognizing the distinctions, but also seeing common struggle against racism, against white supremacy, against what Du Bois would call global color case. And I think that if we're thinking politically, at least, and thinking in those terms, it's really important not to throw up these high barriers, to recognize that the African diaspora does have interests in common, and cultural differences and differences in how we are experienced living in America or living in the UK or living in France shouldn't erase the fact that there are commonalities and connections that are important to identify and maintain and strengthen.
Can I add one thing to that, please? And that is that rhetorically, I prefer just Black.
Yeah.
I prefer without the hyphen in there, because I'm talking about a Pan-African global vision of Blackness. But I want to say in the work that I'm interested in with the Florida Seminoles, I'm talking about an American palenque. A palenque is a term used in Colombia for instance, a place like San Basilio de Palenque, which is a colony of escaped Africans who established their own colony just like they did down in Florida, right? And they're still there today, 400 years later. But what I'm talking about is a commonality of histories, of a commonality of histories of diaspora through enslavement, but also seeking freedom, right? And so, just call it Black, man.
So we have time for 2 more questions, and Eva, I believe you're going to ask us a question from, and then we'll come to you, ma'am. Eva, you're going to ask us a question from the live stream, is that right? From some of our folks who
I
are not
work
here?
at the magazine, and I have been supervising the close to 300 questions that we've gotten on the live stream so far. And
Tell them to tweet them all to Nikole.
She will actually answer them, every single one.
I'm also watching Nicole's mentions. They're there. So this is a question that came in from the Asbury Park Racial Justice Project. They're having a watch party with close to 120 people. And they'd like to know that with all of the major human rights challenges today, how did you decide and convince others that this 400th anniversary deserved an entire issue of the New York Times Magazine? And how did you keep it on course and avoid shiny object syndrome?
Okay. I feel like giving a Twitter answer, which means, well, anyway.
Give the Twitter answer.
Yeah.
It's a Twitter question.
Was the question how do you or how did you? How did you?
How did you? Yes.
Oh, did? Okay, never mind. Take that back. So I was like, don't care. How did it? Surprisingly, so I've gotten this question a lot, and people assume, because y'all just heard the critiques of the organization that pays me, that it would have been a very hard lift to get this amount of resources dedicated to this, and it just wasn't. I came in from leave. Maybe you guys were so glad I actually came back from book leave. I came back from book leave, and I came in within, I think, a week of being back, and I first talked to my editor, Elena, and I said, I have this idea, and I presented it at the Ideas meeting, and immediately at that meeting, Jake said, let's do it. And I only pitched, I pitched an entire issue of the magazine, but all the other pieces that have come with this, I didn't even pitch that. My vision wasn't even that big. So Caitlin decided that she wanted to do a special section, part of the kids section, the daily. It just kept growing bigger and bigger because I think people understood on the magazine, both the power of the moment. I mean, we can look in our society right now and people are trying to grapple with and understand why and how, and history is always instructive. But I also just think they believed in what we were trying to do. So it really, I mean, I get, y'all know me, I critique everything. I critique the Times, I critique, I mean, that's all I do on Twitter all day, is critique news organizations, to critique the way that we fail marginalized communities all the time. But I also think we need to pause and recognize the sheer amount of resources that this organization has put into this. It's unprecedented. And I don't know, every time someone says I might get in trouble for saying this, you should shut up, but I'm gonna say it anyway. You know, this wasn't an easy issue to sell ads for. It's slavery, right? I'm serious. It's not like you have sponsors knocking down your doors necessarily to put their name on the page when you're talking about slavery. There are certain sponsors you can't even take because they participated in slavery. This was not an easy thing to do. And I remember Jake and I had a conversation, and he was like, if we don't sell a single ad, we'll just run ads for HBCUs for free. I don't know if he told advertising that. But I'm just saying to say that it wasn't a given that this was going to somehow be, you know, financially viable product. It was a product, it was something that we believed in and the organization believed in and put a tremendous amount. When you go to your contributors page, trust me, you've never seen anything that's black in the New York Times. The number of black writers, black artists, black photographers, black poets who had their hands in this issue, you just have not seen it. And I am extremely aware because I have studied the Times. I know the vast history of the Times and the way that Times is written about black folks. And I know what this means, that in the paper of record, when people come back 50 years or 100 years from now and they want to understand our society, that they're going to find this thing. So I would never say we shouldn't critique any organization, and we should, and I do. And if somebody got access to my phone right now, I'll probably get in trouble because I have a lot of bad things to say about things that I don't think are going right. But I think we also have to acknowledge how much people cared about this and what we tried to do here.
And I just add one last point to make to that like we do a lot of big projects. Every year we do special issues on a variety of subjects, and some of them get pretty big. And at the magazine, we like to kind of be innovative and do crazy projects and all that. This project got double, triple, quadruple the size of anything that we've ever done. And the reason that it did is not just that this is such an important moment and we all recognize it. It's also all the ways that an institution like the New York Times can, in subtle ways, in indirect ways, and in direct ways, sort of communicate to the group of people who are working on a project like this that the full support of the institution is behind something, but also that you're kind of given a cue to go bigger and to go bigger and to connect with this person over in that department. Oh, they might be interested in this, and that person over in that department might be interested in this. This project drew individuals from all over the building, people who don't even work directly in the newsroom, but who just felt passionate about this. There's so many people in the Times institution that gave above and beyond what they would typically give, in their normal day's work, just because they knew how important this was. And I see some of them here tonight. Thank you for all your extra efforts on this. I could call you all out by name, but again, we want to be respectful of people's time. But that is what took this project and grew it to the level that it is, and I hope we'll continue to grow it in the next couple of months, is all people throughout the organization really participating. And now we come to you for our last question.
So my question connects to something that you've said a little bit earlier. As a person who also gets paid by this lovely institution, I spend a lot of time thinking about the ways in which how we conceptualize what goes on in the world and how we represent what goes on in the world don't always match up. Like, as somebody who's here in the building every day and sees y'all walking around, and I've been working with Mindy on this 400 Years of Inequality project and watching 1619 sort of come up almost simultaneously, which was really interesting. But what are the ways in which we now get to say, we have the last 400 years, what are we going to do with the next 400 years, right? And what are the ways that we as the paper of record are responsible for contributing to what gets remembered? Because unfortunately we live in a society where what is written is what is remembered. What are the ways that we contribute to that memory? What are the ways that we contribute to other people knowing, if our readers are curious and want to know? What are the ways that we inform those folks and draw them into what's really happening and not this idea that like, well, they'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm. I think one way to do this is through not just having this issue look back, and not just have this issue look at the problems of the present, but also look at the resistance to the problems, and to lift that up and to hold on to it. In my specific essay, I talk about J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of modern gynecology, who tortured Black women, Black enslaved women, to perfect his surgeries. So there was a huge resistance to his statue being in Central Park. And now it is not.
Protest.
Yeah, that's right. And so part of the protest, which I love, was theatrical, because women dressed in bloody gowns, calling out the names of the three of the enslaved women who were tortured by him. And they were Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. And now that statue's gone. And it was across from the New York Academy of Medicine, which made it even worse. And now it's moved. And that is that's just one example in my wheelhouse of the resistance that can really make a difference.
I just want to say there were 2 poetry books that were written about the women that were experimented on by J. Marion Sims.
And a play.
Yeah. But I also want to take this and say that outside of the realm of the New York Times, us little chiselers on paper who is carving out our poems and our stories, there's so much history that has not been told yet. It's just laying out there in the history books that has yet to be brought into the public imagination through our work. I think Toni Morrison said one thing. She said, and I'm gonna roughly quote her here, but she said, yes, the world is revealed to us as we step into the future, but at the same time, the past is also revealed to us as we uncover more and more and more about the past that preceded us, that informs our future. Mm-hmm. And we have the opportunity to explore these amazing, life-giving, challenging stories that affirm our humanity as Black people. And I just want to encourage anybody out there with a pencil and pen, anybody Black out there, research your history and bring it to the page.
We do need to wrap up there because we have a special surprise that's going to kind of end the evening. So we do need to wrap up there. We could keep going, obviously, for a lot longer with the questions from the live stream and from all of you. But as I said, we're just beginning the 1619 project tonight. If you have more questions, please send them in. You'll be able to see in the packet with the magazine in the special section that you pick up on your way out. There's some information there about where you can send questions that you have, how you can tweet at us, etc. So I want to just take a moment to thank all of you who have been here tonight, all our panelists. Okay, so as we exit the stage and kind of change the setup here, Nikole and I just have a few last things we want to say as our panelists exit the stage. And in a way, this kind of relates to that last question. When we think about where this project sort of goes from here, and how we take some of the thinking that has come up tonight and that comes up in this issue and move it forward. If you have been inspired by any of what you've read here or heard here tonight or what you're going to read in the issue, we want you to join us in this work, especially those of you who are involved in education or who work with young people. That's a really important way to move this project forward. As we said earlier, there's copies of the magazine out there, and in them you'll see a sheet about our curricular project with the Pulitzer Center. This is going to be a free curriculum that's available for high school and college-age students that turns everything that we have in the issue into a curriculum that can be taught in classes. You can get information about that if your kid is in school and you want them to be learning this, if you're an educator and you want to bring it into your school. If you're involved in working with young people, there's just really great educational materials, and we're very much looking forward to seeing what young people do with this 1619 project and how they can be the ones to move it forward. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to thank you all again for coming. It means the world to me personally. And I hope that you will really sit with what we've produced. It's not perfect. There will certainly be stories that you wish you would have seen or things that you'll critique. And we're fine with that, but I hope you will take it as a whole and understand what we are trying to do in this 400th year, because we cannot change the society if we don't acknowledge how we got here. So again, I thank you all for coming, and
we are now, you've waited till the end, and so we have a very special treat for you, a little reward for sitting through what has been a long program, we know, and that is Vi Higginson Sing Harlem Choir. Please help me welcome them.